Trucking isn't for everyone. The endless hours on the road, the solitude, and the eerie silence of forgotten highways can make even the toughest person uneasy. For Dale, a long-haul trucker of 15 years, the job was second nature. He loved the freedom, the quiet nights, and the hum of his rig's engine. But one night, on a desolate stretch of Route 89, he encountered something he'd never forget. Dale had picked up a load of fresh produce in Idaho destined for a grocery distributor in Arizona. The dispatcher had warned him about a storm brewing, but Dale wasn't worried. He'd driven through worse. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the first drops of rain began to pelt the windshield. He flipped on the wipers, watching the rhythmic swish, swish as the rain intensified. The CB radio crackled. "Any drivers out there on 89? Weather's nasty tonight." Dale grabbed the mic. "This is Blue Ridge Freightliner. I'm heading southbound near mile marker 150. You?" The response came through distorted but clear enough. "Same route, northbound. Be careful out there. Something's off tonight." Dale frowned. Truckers were known for sharing road warnings, accidents, speed traps, and weather. But this? It sounded more ominous than usual. By midnight, the storm was in full swing. Thunder rumbled like distant explosions, and lightning illuminated the road in stark, fleeting bursts. Dale's headlights cut through sheets of rain, revealing nothing but the empty highway ahead. Trees lined the sides, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. At mile marker 162, something flickered on the edge of his vision, a figure on the roadside. Slowing his rig, Dale squinted. A woman stood there, drenched, her long hair plastered to her face. She wore a tattered coat and clutched a small backpack. Against his better judgment, Dale pulled over. She approached cautiously, her eyes wide and darting. When she reached the cab, he rolled down the window slightly. "You all right, miss?" I need help," she stammered, her voice trembling. "My car broke down a few miles back. Can you take me to the next town?" Dale hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't his usual practice, but the storm was brutal, and she looked genuinely frightened. "All right, climb in." She settled into the passenger seat, water pooling at her feet. "Thank you," she whispered. The miles passed in uneasy silence. Dale stole glances at her. She was pale, her hands fidgeting with the straps of her backpack. Something about her didn't sit right. "You from around here?" he asked, trying to break the tension. "No," she said quickly. "Just passing through." Her curt reply ended the conversation. A few miles later, she suddenly spoke. "Don't stop, no matter what you see." Dale glanced at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Just promise me," she insisted, her voice rising. "Whatever happens, don't stop this truck." Before he could press her for answers, the CB radio crackled again. "Blue Ridge Freightliner, you out there?" It was the same voice as before. Dale picked up the mic. "Yeah, still here, what's up?" The voice sounded strained, panicked. "Turn around. Get off 89, now." Dale's stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" The response was drowned out by static, followed by a loud burst of laughter. But it wasn't normal laughter, it was distorted, inhuman. Dale quickly switched off the radio, unease settling deep in his chest. As they approached mile marker 175, the woman began to fidget more. "It's close," she muttered under her breath. "What's close?" Dale demanded, his patience wearing thin. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed ahead. In the glare of his headlights, Dale saw another truck parked across both lanes, blocking the road. Its hazard lights blinked erratically, and its cab door hung open, swinging in the wind. "I'm not stopping," Dale said firmly, his grip tightening on the wheel. The woman nodded. "Good, you can't stop." As they drew closer, Dale noticed something chilling. The truck was identical to his own. Same make, same model. Even the same Blue Ridge Freightliner logo on the side. "What the hell?" he muttered. Then he saw them, figures standing in the rain, motionless, their faces obscured by shadows, dozens of them, lining both sides of the road. "Drive!" the woman screamed. Dale floored the accelerator. The figures didn't move as the rig barreled past, but he could feel their eyes on him. As they cleared the area, the woman let out a shaky breath. "You did good." "What were those things?" Dale demanded. "They're not people," she said, her voice hollow. "They're echoes, trapped on this road." Dale didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but the fear in her voice was palpable. "Why are they here?" "Because this road takes more than it gives," she replied cryptically. The storm began to let up, the rain easing to a drizzle, but the sense of unease lingered. Dale glanced at the woman again, about to ask more questions, when he noticed something odd. Her seat was dry, completely dry. Dale's hands tightened on the wheel. "Where did you say your car broke down?" She didn't answer. When he turned to look at her, the passenger seat was empty. By the time Dale reached the next town, the storm had stopped entirely. He pulled into a truck stop, his hands trembling as he shut off the engine. Inside, he approached the counter, needing a coffee and some answers. "You ever hear anything strange about Route 89? He asked the cashier. The older man behind the counter raised an eyebrow. "You see her?" Dale froze. "Who?" "The hitchhiker," the man said, leaning in. "People say she shows up during storms, warns drivers about the road." Dale's mouth went dry. "What happens to the ones who don't listen?" The man shrugged. "They don't come back." Dale didn't sleep that night. Years later, Dale still drives trucks, but he avoids Route 89 like the plague. Whenever he hears a storm rolling in, he thinks of that night, the strange woman, and the figures lining the road. Some roads, he's learned, have their own rules, and breaking them might cost you more than your life. It might cost your soul. Dale couldn't shake the memory of that night on Route 89. Every detail was burned into his mind. The woman's trembling voice, the eerie laughter on the CB radio, and the ghostly figures in the rain. He told no one about it, but the experience left a lingering unease in his life. Trucking was a job that demanded a clear head, and yet, even years later, Dale found himself checking his mirrors more often, listening for whispers in the static of his CB, and steering clear of certain routes. One night, while parked at a truck stop in Nevada, Dale found himself in a conversation with another long-haul trucker named Pete. Pete was a burly, tattooed man with a gruff voice and a love for sharing road tales over greasy diner food. "You ever have one of those nights that makes you question everything?" Dale asked cautiously, unsure why he was bringing it up. Pete chuckled, shoving a fry into his mouth. "Buddy, you'd be surprised. A lot of strange things happen out there on the road." Dale hesitated, then decided to tell Pete about Route 89. As he recounted the events, Pete's face darkened. "You're lucky," Pete said, leaning back in his chair. "Lucky?" Dale repeated. Pete nodded. "You ever hear about the Phantom Convoy?" Dale shook his head, intrigued despite himself. "Same stretch of road," Pete began, lowering his voice. "Somewhere around mile markers 170 to 180, people have reported seeing a convoy of trucks. They drive in perfect formation, their lights blazing, engines roaring like a thunderstorm. But here's the thing, they're not real. They're echoes, like you said, but not of the living." "What are they?" Dale asked, his pulse quickening. Pete leaned closer. "Legend says it's a group of truckers who died there years ago. Some say it was a freak accident during a storm, others say they were run off the road by something unnatural. Either way, they're stuck, forever repeating their final ride." Dale felt a chill crawl up his spine. "And what happens if you see them?" Pete's expression turned grim. "If you're unlucky enough to cross paths with the convoy, they might just take you with them." Dale laughed nervously, trying to shake the feeling of dread creeping over him. "You're messing with me." Pete shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I've heard enough stories to keep my wheels off that road." The conversation ended soon after, but Dale couldn't stop thinking about it. The Phantom Convoy sounded eerily similar to what he'd experienced. Had he seen the edge of something darker that night? Or had he narrowly escaped becoming part of it? Months later, Dale was driving a new route through New Mexico, a wide stretch of desert highway under a sky full of stars. The memory of Route 89 still haunted him, but he pushed it to the back of his mind. Around 3 a.m., his CB crackled to life. "Blue Ridge Freightliner, you there?" The voice was faint, familiar. Dale's heart skipped a beat. Grabbing the mic, he responded. "Who's this?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, "You didn't keep your promise." Dale's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" he demanded, gripping the wheel tighter. No answer, just static, and then that same distorted laughter he'd heard on Route 89. It grew louder, echoing through the cab like a chorus of disembodied voices. "Enough of this crap," Dale muttered, switching off the CB. But the laughter didn't stop. It was coming from behind him. Dale glanced into his side mirror. At first, he saw nothing but the empty highway stretching into the darkness. But then, faintly, headlights appeared in the distance. One set, then two, then three, a convoy. Panic surged through him. He slammed the accelerator, pushing his rig to its limits. The headlights grew brighter, closing in fast. The laughter was deafening now, surrounding him, reverberating through the cab. "Not again," Dale whispered, sweat dripping down his face. The convoy was right on his tail now, their engines roaring like a storm. Dale could see the trucks clearly in his mirrors, gleaming chrome, spotless paint, and empty cabs. No drivers, just shadows where faces should have been. Dale swerved wildly, trying to outrun them, but the convoy mirrored his every move. The lead truck pulled up alongside him, its horn blaring. Dale glanced over and nearly screamed. The passenger seat of the lead truck wasn't empty. The woman from Route 89 was sitting there, her face expressionless, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She turned her head slowly, locking eyes with Dale. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear over the roar of the engines. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the convoy vanished. Dale pulled over at the next rest area, his hands shaking as he killed the engine. He stumbled out of the cab, gasping for air, his heart pounding like a jackhammer. The parking lot was empty. The highway was silent. He sat on the curb, staring into the distance, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it real? Or was his mind playing tricks on him? As he sat there, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You didn't stop." Dale stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice. He never drove at night again. Dale kept his vow to avoid night driving for a while, but trucking doesn't always offer choices. Deadlines, dispatchers, and the call of the open road forced him back into the nocturnal grind. Though he avoided Route 89 like the plague, his encounters with the strange didn't stop. One summer night, Dale was tasked with a cross-country run hauling steel coils. His route took him along I-40 through Oklahoma's stretch of road, known for its emptiness after dark. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the endless plains. Dale tried to focus on the road, but his nerves were raw. Every flicker of shadow felt like a ghost from his past. By 2 a.m., he was running on caffeine and adrenaline. The highway was deserted except for the occasional pair of headlights in the opposite direction. That's when his headlights picked up something on the side of the road ahead. A figure. At first, Dale thought it was another stranded motorist. A lone man standing at the edge of the road wearing what looked like a mechanic's uniform. As Dale approached, the figure raised an arm, signaling for help. Dale's gut screamed at him to keep driving. Memories of the woman on Route 89 flooded back, but his hand instinctively reached for the brake. He slowed the truck, pulling to a stop a few yards ahead of the man. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, arms still raised. Dale rolled down his window cautiously. "You need help?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even turn toward the truck. "Hey!" Dale called louder, leaning out the window. Still no response. Something was wrong. Dale's skin prickled with unease. He reached for the shifter to pull away, but before he could, the man finally moved. He turned his head slowly, almost unnaturally, to look at Dale. His face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken, like he hadn't slept in decades. His mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, and then he began to walk. The man's steps were slow, deliberate. He didn't blink. Dale's heart pounded as he fumbled to put the truck in gear, his sweaty hands slipping on the shifter. As the truck began to roll forward, the man broke into a sprint. He was fast, inhumanly fast. Within seconds, he was at the driver's side door, slamming his fists against it. Dale floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward with a roar. The man kept pace, his grin never faltering. His fists beat against the door with a force that rattled the cab. "Get away!" Dale shouted, his voice trembling. The man stopped suddenly, falling behind as the truck picked up speed. Dale glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing in the road, but he wasn't there. Dale drove for another hour without stopping, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally pulled into a rest area, he parked under the brightest light he could find and locked all the doors. He didn't sleep. At dawn, he checked the side of his truck. His stomach churned when he saw the dents in the driver's side door. Long streaks ran down the metal like claw marks. Dale's encounters with the unexplained seemed to escalate after that night. On another run through Texas, he swore he heard a voice whisper his name over the roar of his engine. When he stopped at a gas station, the attendant asked why he was traveling with his headlights off, except Dale knew for a fact they'd been on the entire time. The stories began to pile up, each one more unnerving than the last. The man stopped suddenly, falling behind as the truck picked up speed. Dale glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing in the road, but he wasn't there. Dale drove for another hour without stopping, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally pulled into a rest area, he parked under the brightest light he could find and locked all the doors. He didn't sleep. At dawn, he checked the side of his truck. His stomach churned when he saw the dents in the driver's side door. Long streaks ran down the metal like claw marks. Dale's encounters with the unexplained seemed to escalate after that night. On another run through Texas, he swore he heard a voice whisper his name over the roar of his engine. When he stopped at a gas station, the attendant asked why he was traveling with his headlights off, except Dale knew for a fact they'd been on the entire time. The stories began to pile up, each one more unnerving than the last, and stopped suddenly, falling behind as the truck picked up speed. Dale glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing in the road, but he wasn't there. Dale drove for another hour without stopping, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally pulled into a rest area, he parked under the brightest light he could find and locked all the doors. He didn't sleep. At dawn, he checked the side of his truck. His stomach churned when he saw the dents in the driver's side door. Long streaks ran down the metal like claw marks. Dale's encounters with the unexplained seemed to escalate after that night. On another run through Texas, he swore he heard a voice whisper his name over the roar of his engine. When he stopped at a gas station, the attendant asked why he was traveling with his headlights off, except Dale knew for a fact they'd been on the entire time. The stories began to pile up, each one more unnerving than the last. The man stopped suddenly, falling behind. He started to wonder if the road had taken something from him, or if he'd left part of himself behind on Route 89. Then came the final straw. On a run through the Appalachian Mountains, Dale was driving a winding road late at night when the fog rolled in. Thick, soupy, and impenetrable, it swallowed his truck whole. His headlights barely lit the road ahead, and his CB radio was eerily silent. And then he saw them. Headlights appeared in his mirrors, one after another, forming a line. A convoy. Dale's heart stopped. He didn't need to count them to know how many there were. They followed him for miles, their engines roaring, their lights burning brighter than they should. Dale gripped the wheel, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When he rounded a sharp bend, the lead truck pulled up beside him. It was identical to his rig. The driver's window was down, and Dale caught a glimpse of the driver. His own face stared back at him, pale and lifeless, with the same impossible grin he'd seen on the man in Oklahoma. The convoy began to close in, their horns blaring in unison. Dale knew he couldn't outrun them. He closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. When he woke up, his truck was parked on the shoulder of an empty road. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the trees. There was no sign of the convoy, no dents or claw marks on his truck. But Dale knew better. The road wasn't done with him, not yet. He keeps driving because he has no choice. But every time he sees headlights in his mirrors, he wonders if this will be the time they finally take him. Dale's life became a perpetual game of cat and mouse with forces he didn't understand. Every night on the road felt like stepping into a trap. Every highway an invitation for the unknown to play its games. He learned to keep moving, to avoid eye contact with strange figures and ignore voices that whispered his name. But the rules weren't always clear, and the road seemed to invent new ways to test his resolve. One night, Dale found himself on US-50, a desolate stretch often called the loneliest road in America. He was hauling a load of industrial equipment to a remote mining site, and the dispatcher had promised a hefty bonus for the overnight delivery. The money was good enough to silence his better judgment. The road was endless, cutting through the barren Nevada desert under a moonless sky. Dale felt the familiar unease creeping up his spine, the kind that warned him to stay alert. He glanced at his GPS, no turns for another 40 miles, just him, his rig, and the empty road. Or so he thought. Around 2:30 a.m., Dale saw something up ahead, a flicker of movement on the shoulder. At first he thought it was an animal, a coyote, maybe, or a deer. But as he got closer, he realized it was a person, a child. She was standing barefoot on the gravel shoulder, wearing a pale nightgown that fluttered in the desert breeze. Her hair was long and tangled, and her head was tilted downward, as if she were looking at something in her hands. Dale's first instinct was to pull over, but then he remembered rule #1 of the road. Don't stop for anything that doesn't feel right, and this didn't feel right. He slowed down enough to get a better look. As his headlights washed over her, she looked up. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and sunken, and her lips moved as if she were whispering something. But Dale couldn't hear her over the roar of his engine. He pressed on the gas. In his side mirror, he saw her step into the road, her arm outstretched as if reaching for him, but when he glanced back again, she was gone. A few miles later, his CB crackled to life. "Blue Ridge Freightliner, you got your ears on?" Dale froze. That voice, it was the little girl's. He didn't respond. "Why didn't you stop?" she asked, her voice soft and plaintive. Dale turned off the radio, his heart hammering. He gritted his teeth and focused on the road, willing himself to stay calm. But the voice didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was in the cab. "Why didn't you stop, Dale?" Dale slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a halt on the empty highway. He grabbed his flashlight and jumped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he scanned the cab. It was empty. The desert was silent except for the hum of the truck's engine. Dale took a deep breath, trying to convince himself he was imagining things. But when he climbed back into the cab, he noticed something on the passenger seat, a small, dusty handprint. By the time Dale reached his delivery point, dawn was breaking over the horizon. He unloaded the equipment in a daze, barely acknowledging the workers who greeted him. Once he was back on the road, he called Pete. "I think it's happening again," Dale said, his voice shaking. Pete sighed. "You didn't stop, did you?" "No," Dale snapped. "Why would I?" Pete's voice grew grim. "Sometimes stopping isn't about helping them. It's about keeping them from following you." "What the hell does that mean?" Dale demanded. "It means whatever you saw is probably with you now," Pete said, "and it's not going to let go until you deal with it." The next few days were a blur. Dale avoided night routes as much as possible, but the little girl's presence lingered. His truck felt heavier, like something unseen was riding along with him. He began to notice strange things. Faint laughter in the static of his radio, shadows that didn't match his rig's shape, and a persistent chill in the cab, even when the air conditioning was off. Then came the worst night of all. Dale was driving through a wooded stretch of road in West Virginia when his headlights caught something ahead. At first, it looked like a fallen tree blocking the road, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't a tree. It was a line of people. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their heads bowed, their faces hidden by shadows. Some wore tattered clothes. Others looked as though they'd stepped out of another century entirely. Dale slowed down, his palms slick with sweat. "Keep going," he muttered to himself. "Just keep going." But as he inched closer, one of the figures looked up. It was the little girl. Her dark eyes locked onto his, and her mouth twisted into a smile that sent a jolt of terror through him. She raised her hand, pointing directly at him. The rest of the figures followed suit, their heads snapping up in unison, their arms rising to point at his truck. Dale slammed on the gas, barreling straight through the line. As his rig passed through them, the figures dissolved into wisps of smoke. But their voices lingered. "Why didn't you stop?" they whispered, over and over, until the sound faded into the night. Dale never spoke of that night to anyone, not even Pete. But he knew one thing for certain: the road wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it had a way of collecting those who crossed its path. He kept driving because stopping wasn't an option, but deep down he knew the truth. Someday the road would take him too. Months passed, and Dale's encounters with the eerie continued to escalate, each more terrifying than the last. Yet he couldn't bring himself to leave the trucking life. It was all he knew, and deep down he felt that leaving wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was haunting him was tied to the road, sure, but it had also burrowed into him. The longer he drove, the more he suspected that it wasn't a matter of if the road would claim him, but when. One cold November night, Dale found himself heading west through the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. Snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the winding road in white. He was carrying a load of timber, the weight of which made the treacherous, icy roads even more dangerous. It was supposed to be a simple run, but something about the route felt off from the start. The dispatcher had given him an unusually vague delivery address, just a set of GPS coordinates deep in the wilderness. Dale chalked it up to some off-grid logging operation and pushed forward. As he climbed higher into the mountains, the CB crackled to life. "Blue Ridge Freightliner, you out there?" The voice was deep, gravelly, and unfamiliar. Dale hesitated before responding. "This is Blue Ridge, who's calling?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, "You shouldn't be here." Dale's grip on the wheel tightened. He glanced at the CB, as if expecting an answer from the silent static, but no more voices came. The snowstorm intensified, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Dale could barely see the road ahead, relying on his GPS to guide him. It was slow going, the truck struggling against the icy incline. Then he saw it. A pair of taillights ahead, glowing faintly through the swirling snow. Dale felt a flicker of relief. Another trucker. Maybe someone who could confirm he was on the right route. He picked up speed, closing the distance. But as he got closer, something about the lights seemed wrong. They didn't move like normal taillights. They flickered erratically, almost like they were blinking. And then, just as he was about to catch up, they disappeared. Dale slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. His truck skidded slightly on the ice before coming to a stop. He scanned the road ahead, but there was no sign of the vehicle. The only tracks in the snow were his own. "Just tired," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the creeping dread. He shifted into gear and pressed on, but the sense of unease grew stronger with every mile. The forest seemed darker, the snow heavier. The GPS began to glitch, the screen flickering and recalculating the route over and over. And then the road ended. Dale stared at the wall of trees in front of him, his headlights illuminating the dense forest. According to the GPS, this was his destination, but there was no logging camp, no workers, no sign of life. Just snow-covered trees stretching endlessly into the night. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab, his boots crunching on the snow. The air was bitterly cold, and the silence was oppressive. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the trees. No response. He walked a few steps closer to the tree line, scanning the area with his flashlight. That's when he saw it. Footprints. They were small, like a child's, and they led deeper into the forest. Dale felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Not this again," he muttered, turning back toward the truck. But as he reached the cab, he froze. The door was open, and sitting in the driver's seat was the little girl. She turned her head slowly to look at him, her dark eyes gleaming in the pale light. "Why didn't you stop?" she whispered, her voice carrying through the frozen air. Dale stumbled back, his flashlight falling from his hand. When he looked up again, the girl was gone. The truck's door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. He climbed back into the cab, his hands trembling as he slammed the door shut and locked it. The GPS was dead now, its screen blank. The CB radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. He tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic set in as he realized he was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help, and then he heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching in the snow, circling the truck. Dale sat frozen, his breath visible in the cold air. The footsteps stopped at the driver's side door. He didn't dare look. A soft knock broke the silence. "Dale," a voice whispered, "let me in." He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Dale," the voice repeated, now coming from all around him. "You can't run forever." He opened his eyes and screamed. The windshield was covered in handprints, small, dusty handprints that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. They spread across the glass, crawling toward him like something alive. Dale fumbled with the keys, trying the ignition again. This time, the engine roared to life. Without thinking, he threw the truck into reverse, backing out onto the icy road. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The little girl was standing in the middle of the road, her head tilted, her smile wide. Behind her, the taillights reappeared one by one, forming a convoy that seemed to rise out of the snow. They followed him for miles, their lights burning brighter and brighter, until they consumed everything. When Dale woke up, he was parked at a rest area on the edge of the forest. The snowstorm was gone, and the sun was rising over the mountains. His truck was covered in frost, the windshield free of handprints. Everything seemed normal. But Dale knew better. The road wasn't done with him. And the next time, he wouldn't be so lucky. Dale returned to the road with a haunted look in his eyes and a growing weight in his chest. The rest area workers had found him slumped in his truck the morning after the incident in the Cascades, incoherent and trembling. They chalked it up to exhaustion and cold, but Dale knew better. Whatever had happened that night wasn't a hallucination or a dream. It was real, and it had only scratched the surface of its intentions. The strange occurrences followed him like a dark shadow, creeping closer with every trip. It started small. Tools he kept perfectly organized would vanish from the cab, only to reappear hours later, coated in dust as though they'd been buried for years. His mileage logs, kept meticulously for dispatchers, began showing strange gaps, entire stretches of road missing as though they'd never existed. But it was the faces that unnerved him the most. Late one evening, parked at a truck stop in Arizona, Dale leaned back in his seat to rest. The parking lot was quiet, dotted with a few other rigs idling in the night. He stared out the windshield, his mind replaying old nightmares as his eyelids grew heavy. Then he saw them. In the rearview mirror, 3 faces stared back at him from the darkness behind his truck. They were faint, like reflections on water, but unmistakable. 2 men and a woman, their eyes hollow and unblinking, their mouths open as if mid-scream. Dale whipped around, his heart pounding, but the truck's cabin was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, the faces were gone. Shaking, Dale climbed out of the cab and walked around his truck, shining his flashlight into the shadows. The parking lot was silent, except for the hum of idling engines. But when he returned to the cab, the faces were waiting for him, pressed against the glass. The escalation continued over the following weeks. Dale began to hear voices in the engine when he started the truck, low murmurs that grew louder the longer he ignored them. The worst came during a delivery in the Midwest along a remote stretch of road that wound through endless cornfields. The night was still, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Dale's headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the tall stalks swaying gently in the breeze. He was half listening to a late-night talk show on the CB when the signal cut out abruptly, replaced by static. He reached over to fiddle with the dial, and that's when he heard it. A faint laugh, high-pitched and childlike, threading through the static. "Dale," the voice called, clear as day. He froze, his hand hovering over the radio. "Dale, come play," the voice echoed, seeming to come from both the radio and the cab itself. He slammed the radio off, but the laughter persisted, growing louder and more distorted. Something darted across the road ahead, a small figure, pale and fast. Dale slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a halt. He squinted through the windshield, his heart hammering. At the edge of the cornfield, the little girl stood, her white nightgown glowing faintly in the dark. "Why didn't you stop?" she asked, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. Dale tried to move, to shift the truck into gear and drive away, but his body felt frozen. The girl stepped onto the road, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Her dark eyes locked onto his, and that same wide smile spread across her face. As she reached the hood of the truck, her form began to change. Her body stretched unnaturally, her limbs twisting and elongating until she towered over the cab. Her face remained unchanged, that eerie smile now looming above the windshield. "Why didn't you stop?" she repeated, her voice deepening into a guttural growl. The truck shuddered violently as her long fingers slammed against the hood, leaving deep dents in the metal. Dale snapped out of his paralysis and floored the accelerator. The truck roared to life, its tires spinning on the asphalt before gaining traction. He sped down the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. In the mirror, he saw her chasing him, her elongated limbs stretched across the road, her grin never faltering as she moved with impossible speed. Dale pressed the pedal harder, the truck's engine screaming in protest. The girl, or whatever she had become, closed the distance, her claws scraping against the trailer as she reached for the cab. "Why didn't you stop?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the night. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The truck lurched forward, free of her grasp, and the road stretched out empty before him. Dale drove for hours without stopping, his heart racing and his body drenched in sweat. When he finally pulled into a truck stop at dawn, he stumbled out of the cab and inspected the damage. The hood was covered in dents, and long claw marks scored the trailer's sides. Dale sank to his knees, his head in his hands. He didn't need Pete or anyone else to tell him what he already knew. The road had marked him, and it wasn't going to stop until it claimed him entirely. From that day on, Dale refused to drive at night. He stuck to daytime routes. even if it meant taking a pay cut or losing work. But the road had a way of bending the rules, pulling him back into its grasp. The faces in the mirrors, the whispers in the CB, the laughter in the engine. They never truly went away. And every now and then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dale would glance in the mirror and see her. The little girl, standing in the distance, smiling, waiting. Dale tried everything he could to shake the curse that clung to him. He consulted truckers at every stop, seeking advice from the old-timers, the ones who knew the unspoken rules of the road. Many listened with furrowed brows and hesitant nods, but no one offered a solution. Some suggested superstitions, hanging charms, burning sage in the cab, or even painting symbols under the hood to ward off spirits. Dale tried them all, but nothing worked. The road's hold on him tightened. His days became sleepless stretches of paranoia, his nights filled with dread and phantom encounters. And then one day, as winter deepened and the holidays loomed, Dale received a strange assignment. A long haul from Montana to a small, unmarked depot in Alaska. The dispatcher, a gruff man named Jackson, handed him the papers with a warning. "You'll be crossing through some rough terrain. The haul pays extra because nobody else wants to take it this time of year. Roads are dangerous, especially in the dark." Dale hesitated. The last thing he wanted was another midnight run on an isolated highway. But the money was too good. And a small voice in his head whispered that maybe, just maybe, getting far away from his usual routes might help. So, against his better judgment, he took the job. The first part of the trip was uneventful. Snow blanketed the landscape, and the roads were quiet. Dale stuck to daylight driving, parking early to avoid the treacherous nights. But as he crossed into northern Canada, the sun began setting earlier, forcing him into twilight drives through vast stretches of wilderness. The further north he traveled, the stranger things became. The first sign of trouble came in the Yukon. Dale was driving along a narrow road lined with towering pines when he noticed a truck parked on the shoulder up ahead. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, the rig sitting lopsided as if one of its tires had blown. Dale slowed down but didn't stop. He knew better by now. As he passed, he glanced at the cab. The driver was slumped over the wheel, his face obscured by shadows. But then the figure moved, turning its head slowly toward Dale. It wasn't a man. The figure's face was pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow sockets filled with darkness, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, far too wide for a human. Dale's stomach lurched. He hit the gas, speeding past the truck. In his mirror, the figure climbed out of the cab, standing motionless in the road as Dale disappeared around a bend. The encounters grew worse as he neared the Alaskan border. At one point, his CB crackled to life, and an unfamiliar voice whispered his name. The voice was followed by laughter, dozens of voices laughing, overlapping in a chilling cacophony. Another night, he saw strange lights in the woods, blue and green orbs that flitted between the trees, always just out of reach but impossibly fast. By the time he reached Alaska, Dale was running on pure adrenaline. He hadn't slept in over a day, and his nerves were shot. The final leg of the journey took him down an unmarked road deep into a forested valley. The snow fell in heavy sheets, obscuring the trail. The GPS blinked and fizzled, leaving him to navigate by instinct. And then, just as he thought he was hopelessly lost, he saw the lights. A small depot appeared in the distance, its windows glowing warmly. Dale felt a flicker of relief as he pulled up to the building. The place was deserted, but that wasn't unusual for remote deliveries. He climbed out of the cab and knocked on the door. No answer. When he turned back to his truck, he froze. The little girl was standing by the trailer, her head tilted as she watched him. "Why didn't you stop?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Dale stumbled backward, his breath fogging in the cold air. "This has to end," he whispered. The girl smiled, her face calm but her eyes burning with something ancient and malevolent. "It ends when you stop running." Summoning every ounce of courage, Dale took a step forward. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The girl's expression darkened. Her form began to shift, her outline dissolving into smoke and shadow. From the swirling mist, dozens of faces emerged, the same faces that had haunted his mirrors and dreams. "We are the road," the voices whispered in unison. "And you owe us a debt." Dale clenched his fists, his heart pounding. "I've done nothing to you." The figures closed in, surrounding him in a circle of cold, flickering light. "Every mile, every turn, every stop, our eyes have watched you," they said. And now, you belong to us." Dale didn't remember running, but somehow, he found himself back in the cab of his truck. The engine roared to life, the headlights piercing through the snow as he barreled down the road. But the depot was gone. The road ahead twisted and turned in impossible ways, looping back on itself and disappearing into endless darkness. The landscape became unfamiliar. No trees, no snow, just a vast expanse of black. His dashboard lights flickered, the radio blared static, and the mirrors reflected nothing but shadow. And then he heard it, the low, guttural laugh of the road itself. To this day, no one knows what happened to Dale. His truck was found weeks later, abandoned in a clearing deep in the Alaskan wilderness. The cab was empty, the engine cold. But those who drive through that stretch of road sometimes report seeing a lone truck parked on the shoulder. If you slow down, they say, you'll see the driver inside, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror, his lips moving soundlessly. And if you stop, you'll hear his whisper, "Don't run, it only makes it worse." Dale's disappearance became the stuff of trucking legend. At every rest stop and diner along the northern routes, his story was retold and embellished, growing darker with each retelling. Some claimed Dale had become a part of the road, his spirit forever trapped in the endless stretches of asphalt. Others swore they'd seen his truck on foggy nights, idling at the edge of truck stops, its lights flickering like dying stars. But for those who dared to look closer, there was a chilling consistency to the tale. Anyone who encountered Dale's truck didn't come back quite the same. One such encounter happened to a rookie trucker named Kyle, who had heard about Dale's story from his father, a retired driver. Kyle dismissed it as a campfire ghost story, something to keep the greenhorns on edge. But that skepticism didn't stop him from feeling uneasy as he headed north one snowy night, hauling a load of frozen goods to a remote Alaskan town. The road was desolate, the kind of quiet that amplified every creak of the truck and gust of wind. His CB was silent, and his only companion was the occasional moose crossing the road. As Kyle rounded a bend, his headlights caught a truck pulled over on the shoulder. The vehicle was massive, a hulking relic with rusted edges and faded blue paint. Its trailer looked battered, the markings almost erased by time. Something about the sight made Kyle's skin crawl. He slowed as he approached, curiosity tugging at him despite the gnawing sense of dread. The truck's headlights flickered weakly, as if trying to signal him. Kyle grabbed his CB mic. "You okay there, buddy?" he asked, his voice echoing in the cab. Static hissed from the radio, followed by a faint whisper, "Keep driving." Kyle's stomach twisted. He hit the brakes, stopping a safe distance from the truck. He leaned out his window, squinting through the snow. There was no movement inside the cab, no sign of life. And then he saw the door slowly creak open. A man stepped out, his form hazy in the swirling snow. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by a hooded jacket. Something about the way he moved was wrong. His gait was jerky, as if he were a puppet on invisible strings. Kyle's instincts screamed at him to drive away, but he hesitated. What if the guy was injured or stranded? "Need some help?" Kyle called out. The man stopped in his tracks. Slowly, he turned to face Kyle, pulling back his hood. Kyle's blood ran cold. It was Dale. The stories hadn't done him justice. Dale's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken into dark hollows that seemed to devour light. His lips were cracked, his smile wide and unnatural. "You shouldn't have stopped," Dale said, his voice a hollow echo. Kyle's foot shot to the accelerator, but his truck didn't budge. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in the middle of the road. Dale's grin widened as he walked closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "You hear them, don't you?" Dale whispered, his voice now coming from all around Kyle. Kyle's ears filled with a rising chorus of whispers, faint and unintelligible at first, but growing louder with every passing second. The voices seemed to seep into his mind, weaving disjointed phrases and dark warnings. "The road takes what it's owed. You're part of it now. Run, but it will follow." Kyle clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices only grew louder, reverberating through his skull. Outside, Dale's form began to shimmer, splitting into multiple versions of himself, each one twisted and distorted, their faces frozen in grotesque grins. The figures surrounded Kyle's truck, their hands pressing against the windows. Their touch left smudges that glowed faintly in the dark, forming strange, spiraling patterns. Kyle scrambled for his phone, but the screen was dead. Even his flashlight flickered and died. Panic surged through him as he banged on the dashboard, desperate to restart the truck. "Please," he shouted, his voice cracking. The figures stopped moving. The whispers ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Dale's original form leaned against the driver's side window, his hollow eyes boring into Kyle's. "You didn't listen," Dale said softly, "and now you're part of the road." The figures dissolved into shadow, melting into the snow. The truck's engine roared to life, the headlights piercing through the darkness. Kyle didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into gear and tore down the road, his heart pounding in his chest. The radio crackled to life, static giving way to faint laughter. Kyle made it to his destination, but he wasn't the same. His co-workers noticed the change immediately. The dark circles under his eyes, the way he flinched at every sound. He quit trucking soon after, retreating to a small town where he could avoid long stretches of road. But no matter how far he went, the voices followed. Late at night, when the wind howled through the trees, Kyle swore he could hear Dale's whisper, "Keep driving, or don't stop, it's always waiting." And sometimes, when he passed a truck stop or an empty stretch of highway, he saw it, a battered blue truck, idling in the shadows, its headlights flickering, waiting for the next traveler to join the road. The legend of Dale's truck continued to spread, whispered between truckers over late-night coffee and cigarettes at dimly lit diners. Each telling added a chilling new detail. Some claimed the truck carried ghostly passengers. Others swore it appeared only during snowstorms. And a few even believed that Dale himself had become the truck, a sentient, cursed machine prowling the endless highways in search of new victims. One such victim was Amanda, a veteran trucker with a reputation for keeping her cool under pressure. She was tough, no nonsense, and had no patience for ghost stories. When she first heard about Dale's truck from a jittery rookie, she laughed it off. "Spooky trucks, huh?" she said with a smirk. "Next thing you'll tell me, Bigfoot's driving one of them." But her skepticism would be short-lived. Amanda had picked up a long-haul job hauling freight from Idaho to the remote oil fields of northern Alberta. It was winter, and the route would take her through some of the most desolate, snowbound roads in North America. She relished the challenge, seeing it as just another test of her mettle. The first few days of the trip were uneventful. She pushed through snowdrifts and icy roads with ease, her trusty rig handling like a dream. But as she crossed into the wilderness of northern British Columbia, the weather turned. A storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the sky. Snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Amanda kept her wits about her, inching forward with a defroster on full blast and her headlights cutting narrow beams through the storm. That's when she saw it. A pair of dim taillights appeared in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. They blinked in and out of view as though the truck ahead was struggling to stay on the road. "Poor guy must be having a rough time," Amanda muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. She closed the distance slowly, the shape of the truck becoming clearer. It was an older model, its trailer battered and weathered. Something about it seemed off. The way it swayed on the road, the faint groaning sound that carried through the storm, Amanda couldn't quite put her finger on it, but a knot of unease began to form in her stomach. She decided to pass. Flipping on her turn signal, Amanda eased into the left lane and crept forward. As she pulled alongside the truck, she glanced at the cab. What she saw made her blood run cold. The driver was staring straight ahead, his face illuminated by the eerie green glow of his dashboard. He was impossibly thin, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. But it was his eyes that froze Amanda in place. They were sunken, empty pits of darkness, as if his soul had been hollowed out. And then he turned to look at her. The truck jerked violently, its engine roaring as it swerved into Amanda's lane. She barely had time to react, slamming on the brakes as the other truck veered dangerously close, its trailer skidding on the icy road. "What the hell?" Amanda shouted, gripping the wheel as her rig fishtailed. She managed to regain control, her heart hammering in her chest, but the other truck didn't stop. It barreled ahead, its taillights fading into the snowstorm. Amanda sat frozen for a moment, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She considered pulling over to regroup, but a strange compulsion urged her forward, as if she had to follow that truck. The storm grew worse, the wind howling like a living thing. Amanda's GPS flickered and died, leaving her to navigate by instinct. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the snow swallowing everything in its path. And then she saw them, figures standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the blizzard. They were scattered at irregular intervals, their forms unnaturally still. At first, Amanda thought they were stranded motorists, but as she got closer, her stomach dropped. They weren't people, they were something else. Their faces were featureless, smooth as porcelain, their bodies wrapped in tattered clothing that fluttered in the wind. One of them raised a hand as she passed, its fingers impossibly long. The figures grew more frequent, appearing in greater numbers along the roadside. Some stood motionless, while others turned their heads to watch her pass. Their blank faces seemed to follow her, their presence oppressive and inescapable. Amanda's grip on the wheel tightened, her breath fogging up the cab as panic set in. She reached for her CB radio, desperate for a voice, any voice, to break the silence. "Anyone out there? This is Rig 47, heading north on 37. I think I'm losing it. Can someone?" Her voice cut off as the radio crackled to life. A deep, distorted voice filled the cab, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have followed." Amanda's blood turned to ice. She slammed the radio off, but the voice continued, echoing through the cab as if it were coming from the very walls. "Turn back now or you'll join us." The headlights of Dale's truck appeared again, this time directly ahead of her. It was parked sideways across the road, blocking her path. Amanda hit the brakes, her truck skidding to a halt just feet from the other rig. The snow swirled around them, the storm eerily quiet for a moment. The driver's door of the other truck creaked open, and a figure climbed out. It was Dale. He moved slowly, his gaunt frame illuminated by Amanda's headlights. His eyes met hers through the windshield, and he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "But this is where your journey ends." Amanda's instincts screamed at her to run, but she was frozen in place. The air in the cab grew heavy, the temperature plummeting as frost crept up the windows. Dale reached out, placing a skeletal hand on the hood of her truck. The engine sputtered and died, leaving her in total silence. "Welcome to the road," Dale whispered, his voice echoing in her mind. "It's always hungry." The figures from the roadside began to close in, their blank faces now twisted into grotesque shapes. They surrounded the truck, their hands pressing against the glass, leaving smudges that glowed faintly in the dark. Amanda screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. Her truck was found days later, abandoned on the side of the road. The cab was empty, the engine dead. And some nights, along that lonely stretch of highway, drivers swear they see her rig, idling in the snow, its headlights flickering, waiting. The chilling tales of the cursed road didn't end with Amanda's disappearance. Her story became another link in the growing chain of dark legends whispered by truckers on midnight runs. The thought of Dale's truck, eternally prowling the frozen highways, unsettled even the most hardened road warriors. But some truckers are drawn to danger. For them, the idea of facing Dale's truck wasn't a deterrent, it was a challenge. One of these fearless souls was a man named Eddie Red Malone, a seasoned driver known for his devil-may-care attitude and an iron will. Eddie had heard every story about Dale's truck and dismissed them all. "Ghost trucks, haunted highways, give me a break," he'd say, chuckling over his coffee at roadside diners. But deep down, part of him was intrigued. If the stories were true, he wanted to see it for himself. One fateful winter, Eddie got his wish. It was a routine haul, a run from Anchorage to the Arctic coast. The roads were treacherous this time of year, but Eddie was no stranger to driving in brutal conditions. He packed extra provisions, fueled up his rig, and set out as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The snow came in flurries, but the roads were passable. Eddie kept his CB radio on, chatting with other drivers and exchanging weather updates. But as he neared a particularly remote stretch of road, the chatter died off. Static filled the airwaves, and the sense of isolation grew palpable. That's when Eddie spotted it. A faint pair of taillights appeared in the distance, glowing dimly through the falling snow. Eddie's pulse quickened. The lights flickered irregularly, as if the truck ahead was struggling to stay on the road. He picked up his CB mic and tried to hail the driver. "Hey there, buddy, you having some trouble? Need a hand?" No response. The static on the radio grew louder, carrying faint whispers Eddie couldn't quite make out. A chill ran down his spine, but he shrugged it off. Probably just a bad signal. he muttered. As he drew closer, the truck ahead became clearer. It was old, much older than anything still on the road today. Its trailer was riddled with dents and rust, and its paint was a faded, weather-beaten blue. Eddie's bravado faltered. He knew the stories. Determined not to let fear get the best of him, Eddie decided to pass. He flipped on his turn signal, pulling into the left lane and accelerating. But as he moved alongside the truck, his rig began to shudder. The steering wheel fought against him, and his headlights dimmed. Glancing out his side window, Eddie got his first look at the other driver. It was Dale. The gaunt, hollow-eyed figure turned to face him, a predatory grin stretching across his face. Eddie's heart skipped a beat, but instead of panic, a wave of anger surged through him. "You think you're gonna scare me, you old ghost?" Eddie growled. He floored the accelerator, pushing his truck ahead of Dale's rig. For a moment, it worked. Eddie's rig surged forward, leaving the cursed truck behind. But then the temperature inside his cab plummeted. Frost crept across the windshield, and the radio exploded with static. "You shouldn't have done that," a deep, guttural voice growled, filling the cab. The road ahead twisted and warped, the snow whipping into unnatural shapes that danced and swirled like living things. Eddie gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel as his truck groaned under some unseen strain. In the rearview mirror, he saw Dale's truck barreling toward him, its headlights glowing with an unnatural light. The engine roared like a feral beast, growing louder with each passing second. Eddie had no choice but to push forward. He slammed the pedal to the floor, his rig screaming as it tore through the snowstorm. The road narrowed, the edges disappearing into a void of swirling darkness. "You wanted to see me," the voice whispered. "Now you'll never leave." Ahead, the road seemed to drop off into nothingness. Eddie's instinct screamed at him to stop, but there was no time. His rig hurtled forward, the headlights piercing through the dark. And then he was falling. The cab shook violently as the truck hit something solid. The world around him shifted, the storm vanishing in an instant. Eddie blinked, his heart pounding. He was no longer on the highway. Instead, he found himself on an endless stretch of cracked, blackened asphalt. The sky above was an unnatural shade of red, swirling with dark clouds that seemed alive. The air was heavy, oppressive, and filled with the distant sound of engines and horns. Dale's truck appeared in the distance, idling in the middle of the road. Its headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the desolate landscape. "You're on my road now," the voice growled, echoing through Eddie's mind. Eddie tried to turn his truck around, but the controls were unresponsive. His rig began to move on its own, drawn inexorably toward Dale's truck. The whispers returned, louder this time, their words twisting and overlapping. "The road takes what it's owed. You thought you could outrun it. There's no escape." Dale's truck roared to life, its engine screaming as it charged toward Eddie. The two trucks hurtled toward each other, a collision inevitable. Eddie braced himself, gripping the wheel tightly. The impact never came. Instead, Eddie awoke in his cab, parked on the side of a snow-covered road. His truck was intact, the engine idling softly, but something was wrong. The world outside seemed different. The snow was black, falling in slow, unnatural spirals. The trees along the roadside were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. His CB crackled to life, and a familiar voice spoke, "Welcome to the road, Eddie. You'll drive it forever." Eddie looked in the rearview mirror. Dale was sitting in the passenger seat, grinning, and the road stretched on endlessly before him. Eddie tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His hands trembled as they gripped the steering wheel, and his pulse thundered in his ears. His head spun with confusion, panic, and disbelief. What had just happened? Was it a dream, a hallucination? Or was he truly caught in some cursed version of reality, one where the road never ended? He glanced over at the passenger seat where Dale sat, his skeletal figure staring out the windshield with hollow, vacant eyes. His grin hadn't faded. It was the same unsettling, predatory grin that Eddie had seen in the rearview mirror, just before the truck had crashed into him. The world outside was bleak, suffocating in its stillness. There were no other vehicles, no road signs, no landmarks, just endless black asphalt, stretching into infinity, shrouded by the eerie snow that fell in slow motion, blanketing the world with a darkness that felt alive. The trees were twisted and bent, their branches clawing at the sky, creating an almost suffocating sense of oppression. And then Eddie noticed something else, the sound. At first he hadn't been able to place it. But now it was unmistakable. The subtle hum of engines, distant but growing louder. The faint sound of horns honking, faint conversations, laughter. But it wasn't right. It sounded wrong, distorted, as though it was coming from another dimension, echoing through the very fabric of reality. The voices whispered his name. Eddie, Edie, you've been chosen. The realization hit him like a freight train, his stomach dropping to his feet. He wasn't alone. Where am I? Eddie stammered, his voice cracking. Dale's lips twitched into a cruel smile. You're on the road, Eddie. My road. The road of endless travelers. Eddie's pulse pounded in his ears as he tried to make sense of it. What do you mean, your road? His hands clenched the wheel so tight his knuckles went white. This isn't real. It can't be real. Oh, it's real, Dale said, his voice low and haunting. Once you've crossed onto this road, you're bound to it. Forever. No turning back. Eddie's eyes darted from the twisted landscape outside the window to Dale's cold, unblinking stare. But I'm not dead. I can't be dead. This is insane. Dale chuckled softly, a hollow, raspy sound. No, not dead, but dead enough. The road claims those who dare to defy it. You can drive for eternity, but you'll never leave. You'll never find your way out. You're a part of the road now. Eddie's breath quickened, his mind racing. The whispers were louder now, almost overwhelming, as if 1,000 voices were pressing in on him. Some sounded like familiar truckers he'd known over the years. Others were strangers, voices filled with despair, anger, and regret. Who are all those voices? Eddie asked, his heart thudding in his chest. They're like you, Dale answered. Trapped. Once you drive long enough, you become one of us. A part of the endless highway. The road calls to you and you answer. It's a fate worse than death because there's no escape. There's no peace. Eddie felt his throat tighten. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be part of this nightmare. The sinister grin on Dale's face stretched wider. You were never given a choice. No one is. The road chooses who stays. Some are broken before they even know it. Others, they refuse to listen. But in the end, the road always wins. Suddenly, Eddie's truck jolted violently, throwing him forward against the seatbelt. His heart nearly leaped out of his chest as the engine sputtered. The truck lurched as if it were being dragged by some invisible force. The truck's headlights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to come alive. The road ahead shimmered, warping and twisting in ways that defied logic. The snowstorm intensified, the wind howling as though the very air itself was alive, screaming in pain. Look, Dale said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Look at what awaits you. Eddie's eyes followed Dale's pointed finger to the horizon. There, in the distance, he saw a glimmer of light. As the truck moved closer, the lights grew brighter, flickering street lamps that lined a street. It wasn't a normal street. It was a street lined with trucks. Hundreds, maybe thousands of rigs. Their engines dead, their drivers nowhere to be seen. Their windows were covered in frost, and strange markings were scratched into the glass. The trucks were abandoned, yet they all seemed to glow with a strange, otherworldly light. Who are they? Eddie whispered, his voice trembling. They are the lost, Dale replied, his voice thick with a twisted satisfaction. All the souls who've driven these roads before you. They never leave. They're trapped in the trucks in their own eternal loops, like you will be soon enough. Eddie's mind reeled, and his eyes were wide with panic. He slammed his foot on the gas, desperate to speed past the eerie, ghostly convoy. But his rig wouldn't obey. It refused to accelerate, the engine sputtering in protest. No, 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 Eddie shouted, but the truck continued its relentless crawl toward the convoy. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were filling the cab, clawing at his mind. Welcome. Welcome to the endless road. You can never leave. Keep driving, Eddie. Keep driving. There's nowhere else to go. The truck rolled forward, coming to a stop in the middle of the convoy. Eddie's chest tightened as the engine died. He turned toward Dale. I didn't sign up for this. His voice broke. Dale leaned back in his seat, his grin never wavering. You didn't have to. The road chose you. And now you'll never be alone again. The snow around Eddie's truck began to swirl in a vortex, forming into shapes that seemed vaguely human. Figures with faces twisted in agony materialized in the wind, their eyes hollow and empty. They reached toward the truck, their hands scraping against the glass. Eddie screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. As the figures surrounded the rig, they began to whisper his name. "Eddie! Edie, welcome!" Eddie's grip on the wheel loosened as a cold numbness began to settle in his limbs. He felt his own body growing weaker, his vision blurring. The truck, the road, the voices, it was all merging into one unrelenting nightmare. And then, just as the darkness closed in around him, a new voice broke through. This one was clear, strong. "Eddie!" He jolted awake, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles bled. The snow had stopped. The road was clear. But the figures, they were still there, standing on the side of the road, their eyes locked on him. The road stretched on forever, and Eddie realized he would never be free. The road had claimed him. Eddie's breath came in sharp gasps as his eyes scanned the empty, endless stretch of road. The figures along the roadside, those twisted, faceless forms, hadn't moved, but their presence weighed heavily on him. The air around him felt thick, pressing down on his chest as though the world itself was suffocating him. He reached for the gear shift, his hands trembling, but the truck refused to move. It was as though the vehicle had a mind of its own, unwilling to leave the spot where it had stopped. "Come on," Eddie muttered, his voice hoarse. "Come on, just move." But the truck didn't respond. It sat there idle as if it had been waiting for him to accept what had happened. The whispering voices returned, louder now. They seemed to be coming from everywhere. From the very walls of the truck, from the asphalt beneath him, from the trees lining the road. They pressed in on his mind like a vice. "Eddie, you've made your choice. You'll never leave." "No!" Eddie shouted, slamming his fist against the dashboard. "This can't be real. This is just some twisted dream. It has to be." But no matter how much he screamed, no matter how hard he hit the wheel, the reality of his situation wouldn't change. The road stretched endlessly before him, and the truck refused to move. Eddie had been driving for days, or was it weeks? Time no longer had any meaning on this cursed highway. The days blurred together in an endless cycle of darkness and snow, with no sign of respite. He no longer knew if he was the one controlling the truck, or if the truck was controlling him. It was as if the road had become a part of him, a twisting, pulsing entity that fed on his fear, his anger, his despair. And the whispers, those haunting whispers, never stopped. "They're coming for you, Eddie." The voice of Dale hissed through the radio one night, breaking the silence. "You can't outrun them. They're already here." Eddie looked around in a panic, his heart racing. The storm outside the cab was worsening, the wind howling like some kind of predatory beast. But there was nothing. No other vehicles, no signs of life. Only the ever-present darkness of the highway and the oppressive snowfall. But then, as if to answer Dale's ominous words, a new sound reached his ears, a faint clicking. At first he thought it was the sound of his own fingers tapping against the steering wheel, but when he stopped it continued. Click. C-click. Dot click. The sound came from outside the cab. His eyes snapped to the side window, but the swirling snow blocked his view. The truck's interior light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the cabin. The clicking sound grew louder, like nails tapping against glass. He turned to look in the side mirror. His heart skipped a beat. In the reflection, he saw the faint outline of someone, standing just outside the truck. A figure, a man, or at least what appeared to be a man, standing motionless in the blizzard. The figure was tall, gaunt, and cloaked in a long coat that billowed in the wind. But what truly caught Eddie's attention was the face. The man's face was not human. His eyes were sunken, hollow pits of darkness, devoid of life. His skin was pale and stretched tight over the bones of his face, his mouth twisted in a grotesque grin that was far too wide for a normal human. The lips cracked as though they had been sewn together, and his teeth were jagged and sharp. Eddie recoiled in horror, slamming his foot on the gas pedal, but the truck refused to move. The figure in the mirror didn't move either, standing still as if waiting for something. The clicking continued. It was getting closer. "Please," Eddie whispered to himself, his hands shaking. "Not again, not again." The figure in the mirror was now closer. Eddie could hear the faint scraping sound of boots against the icy road. He knew deep down that whatever was out there had been watching him, and whatever it was coming for him. Click. C-click. Dot click. The truck's headlights flickered, and for a split second, the figure vanished from the mirror. A loud bang echoed through the cab, causing Eddie to jump in his seat. The truck lurched forward as though something had slammed into it from behind. He jerked the wheel, trying to keep control, but the force was overwhelming. The road began to twist again, the asphalt buckling and cracking beneath the tires. Eddie's vision blurred as the world outside seemed to warp, the horizon bending in unnatural ways. The road ahead stretched on forever, but now there were more figures, hundreds of them, standing by the side of the road. Some were moving now, walking toward him, their faces twisted and contorted in ways that defied human logic. His hands gripped the wheel harder, his knuckles white with fear. But there was nowhere to go. The figures began to crowd around the truck, their hands outstretched, pressing against the windows. "Eddie," a voice whispered from behind him, one he recognized all too well. "You'll never escape. You're one of us now." Eddie twisted in his seat, heart hammering. Dale stood there behind him, staring into his eyes with that same empty, predatory grin. "No!" Eddie screamed. "No, I'm not like you." But Dale didn't respond. Instead, his hands reached toward Eddie, his fingers long and cold. Eddie pushed himself back into the corner of the cab, his body trembling, but there was no escape. The figures outside were closing in, their cold, clammy hands smearing the glass, leaving trails of frost. The truck groaned, its engine sputtering, as if it too was in agony. The figures were now pressing against the truck, their faces mere inches away from the glass. Suddenly, the windshield shattered with a deafening crash, and a cold wind rushed into the cab. Eddie's eyes widened as the figures outside reached in, their hands now gripping the edge of the door. "You'll never leave," they chorused in unison, their voices merging into a single haunting refrain. And just like that, Eddie understood. There was no escape. The truck was never found. Days later, a highway patrol unit passed through the area and found an abandoned rig on the side of the road, its engine still idling. The doors were wide open, and the interior was covered in frost. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was unnaturally cold. The patrol officers could find no trace of the driver. Some nights, late at night, truckers passing that stretch of road swear they see a rig parked along the highway, its headlights flickering in the distance. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear the whispers, the voices of the lost, of those who once traveled this cursed road. They say, if you're brave enough to stop, you might even see them, the figures, the lost drivers, and Dale himself, standing along the road, waiting for the next victim to take their place. And when you hear that faint clicking sound, the tapping of nails against the truck's glass, you'd best drive away as fast as you can, because if you don't, you might find yourself trapped on the road.